Okay, promissory estoppel is the next thing we are going over. And chronologically in the class, this doesn't follow necessarily how our lessons went because we went through all of the prior restatements that we just went over and then went into promissory estoppel. And so, and then we went to the UCC and then promissory estoppel. So in the chronology of it is a little bit different, but in terms of where I have it on my outline, that's where it at. So I'm gonna just do it now. And to go over promissory estoppel, I think it is instructive to go over a few cases to see what what it is. And so the language of Section 90 is that a promise which the promisor should reasonably expect to induce action or forbearance on the promisee or third person, in which does induce such action or forbearance, is binding, okay, if what? If injustice can be avoided only by enforcement of the promise. The remedy granted for the breach may be limited as justice requires. Okay, that's a whole lot, and I think it's instructive for the case to showcase what this means. And two, a charitable subscription or a marriage settlement is binding under subsection 1 without proof that the promise induced action or forbearance. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but to showcase what promissory estoppel is, we're going to showcase it through a case. So this case, it's Pops Cones Inc. versus Resorts International Hotel. And I think this felt like the most instructive one because it felt very obvious. But in short, um, P P is a small uh chain of frozen yogurt. I've froze oh my God. Frozen yogurt. And they got into negotiations with what was it? Resorts. It's a kind of casino in Atlantic City. This is in New Jersey, on this like very famous boardwalk. And so, as you can imagine, Pops really wanted to be there. They're like, "You're gonna offer this? We want to be there because we're gonna make a ton of money there." And so, they started to discuss having a potential Pops location, right? Discuss potential Pops location on Boardwalk, which was a very profitable area. So, as you can imagine, Pops very invested. Okay. Um, so they got to a point where D even gave P, which is Pops, right, the plaintiff, um, like a little temporary like cart to like test out test out the business, right? This place is pretty poppin', and it was during the summertime where people are more likely to buy ice cream and frozen yogurt and whatnot. And so they did, and I mean, they were just as anxious to get a deal done. Okay. So, um, what ended up happening is that they started to go into a deal negotiation, and that Tob, well, they eventually landed at, well, what we need is like the potential deal will be, um, like a 6 year term, right? So I'm gonna be locked in there for 6 years, and you get like 7% of my profits, right? And so that was like generally on the table, and they kept following up. And you know, um, given that this is an ice cream business, they were kind of looking to do it soon so that they can get ready for the next cycle of hot days. And so um, when they got into that deal, D, the defendant, replied with like it's probably going to happen. Replied with, the deal is about 95% to a deal, and that and that we just need a signature. And so to the reasonable person right here, this is like, whoa. I mean, it sounds like we got a deal. Like you're saying that it's just one more step, and that step doesn't sound like a very tough step. And so, um, in a way, it kind of assured P. And so, um, P Pop, right? He needed to know because they had to decide whether to renew their lease for their prior location. And so they had to know, and then that's what they got replied with. And so he was like, okay, cool. So I'm gonna be cool with not renewing this lease. And you can kind of guess what happens here, but eventually, right, they don't come to a deal. And as a matter of fact, um, like Resorts proposes a different deal. And like they backed out eventually. They backed out. And as you can imagine, D was very upset, or P, Pops was very upset because they kind of relied on that promise. And so they sued for promissory estoppel. Okay. So P sued on uh, promissory estoppel. Okay. Now, in short, not to make this like super long, he relied on it, right? He reasonably knew that, it was reasonably foreseeable that that message by Resorts Hotel by the defendant, that there's reasonable idea that he would rely on that promise, and that not only that, but it was reasonable to know that when he said that, they would rely on it. Okay. And because he was so harmed by that reliance, um, this is a place where even though it's not a contract, there's nothing in here that says contract, um, and it's not necessarily how you want to do things, but we will still enforce it because otherwise this would be wildly unjust for Pops. And so the holding eventually is enforce it under promissory stop because it met the conditions, right? And the conditions we see in restatement 90, right? But this kind of paints the idea of promissory estoppel in that, like, sometimes in life, there are things that people will rely on somebody, and that in that reliance, something may happen in which they relied so heavily, and then the other party backs out, or something happens and they can't fulfill what was originally promised to them. And because that can be so unjust, there is this part of the restatement that says, well, there in these moments, it will be enforceable um, because the breach, so we can avoid such an injustice. Okay, and so that's going to be essentially section 90 is going to talk about when you do it. There are elements to this, and I didn't go over the specific elements of it, but it's a lot about like the reasonableness of doing it, the reasonableness of knowing that when you said it, it would do it, and that there's an injustice that can only be avoided uh, by enforcement. Nice. We're gonna move into the UCC. We're gonna come back to the statute of frauds, but hopefully that painted a picture of promissory stuff.